tuning in the program called What's Going On FlintTalkRadio.com. We had to check the sound before we got on the air this afternoon, and we had to make sure that it was up to speed, and I think it's up to the quality and standard we try to maintain here at FlintTalkRadio.com. If it's not up to speed, we have to go ahead and shoot the technicians. We don't do any shooting around here, though. We're practitioners of Dr. King. And as we're coming up to the 5th anniversary of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, as you know, that Dr. King gave on August the 28th, 1963. We are going to be paying attention to that as they begin to congregate in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. And I'm sure they're going to have a lot of the people there making a lot of statements, some of which will be hyperbole, some of which will be true. But I want to read some of the history before we get there, so when you finally hear the speeches and the hyperbole, you'll be able to put it in context. Because we're not going to let them get away with anything as far as making claims that go beyond the evidence. And I brought the evidence here this afternoon, not just in Time Magazine, which has an issue out that came out for this week called The Founding Father, and it has Dr. King on the front cover. And it's Dr. Martin Luther King, Architect of the 21st Century, written by John Meekum. I'm not sure if he's the architect of the 21st century, but he certainly was one of the architects in the latter part of the 20th century, and turned a lot of things upside down their heads. And to Dr. King, we give him a lot of credit for having been resolute in his determination to change the discourse of the country around race. And I have to give him a lot of credit for having stayed the course until the bitter end in his case, because, as you know, Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. We're going to say a few things here this afternoon that nobody else is saying, and I think that's because a number of things have gotten lost, as is stated in Levering Lewis' book, called originally called, when it was first put out in 1969, 1970, it was called King, A Critical Biography. But when they memorialized Dr. King's name and made him an iconic figure and gave him a national holiday in 1983, which was celebrated for the first time in 1986, they could no longer say critical so much, because Dr. King's iconic status had been raised and elevated to a certain extent, where he became almost on the same level as the founding fathers. They say founding father here in Time Magazine, but the founding fathers that really were at the foundational points where the nation itself was being built out of the ashes of what had occurred in the fight with England that went on for 7 years, from 1776 to 1783, ending with the Treaty of Paris that was signed, that made it official that the war had come to a close. And now we get to rebuild that which was destroyed, since all of the fighting occurred on the land space of what would later on become the United States. And that was the original founding fathers, and now they're saying that Dr. King was the founding father in terms of being the architect of the 21st century. I would say the correction should be the 20th century. But certainly a founding father in the sense that Dr. King restored some of the things that we stated at the very beginning of the country and made it more real and more credible, because it included more people. And I think that's why we should be meeting around Dr. King's efforts and his vision that he gave in 1963. In what, 2 days now? I think it'll be Wednesday this week when we get together and began to look at what they'll be doing in Washington as they commemorate this 5th anniversary. I do want to say, on the other hand, there'll be a lot of the charlatans there, and I want to point some of them out before we leave the studio this afternoon. And I think it's going to be continued with, I'm going to make an assumption here, and I have not talked to the ones who will be coming on the day at 3:30 in Satora's Black History Corner here at FlintTalkRadio.com. But I do think that they probably, more than likely, I'm going to say a great probability, that they will be talking about Dr. King as well, because I know the kind of understandings they have of history, and I think they'll probably be carrying this forward. And I'll be looking forward to see what they're going to be talking about along the same lines. But I think I'm going to be saying some things this afternoon that no one else is saying, and nobody else will be pointing out some of them because they have vested interests. And they want these facts that I'm going to be talking about to get buried underneath the surface, but I'm going to bring the documentation. I'm going to bring on the pain. And some of the pain I'll be bringing on is the documentation, because some of this documentation is going to make an indictment against some of the ones that they're standing in front of the public right now, trying to make an assumption, make us assume, and trying to carry forth the assumption that they were there at the very beginning and they did all these wonderful things here. And lo and behold, that's why we are standing in front of the community right now as the persons who inherited the mantle that was dropped by Dr. King at his assassination point. And I'm going to be making some points about whether or not that is true, because we've got to restore some of the evidence to the table and have that as part of the public discourse. But we'll see. We'll see how it comes out. And if you have any questions about anything we're talking about here and want to join the conversation, and you're with us live rather than picking us up later on Ustream, you can call us at 810, I'm reading the number here, at this other camera over on this side, 208-1854. We have teleprompters in here. I don't read from the teleprompter, but they do have them in here, and we can look at some of the things you have to do with the studio, one of which is the number that's over here on this one, and that 810-208-1854. You can call the studio, and in that way you can give John a headache because he's the one who's got to answer the phone. I just sit here and take all the credit. Again, thank you for staying tuned, and I want you to stay tuned to all the programs here at flinttalkradio.com. We're working very hard here at the studio to win your trust and keep your confidence, because we do not want to come in second best in anything. And we are the #1 podcast program here in the city of Flint, Genesee County. But we are not satisfied in stopping there. We're going to keep going until we become the CNN of all the podcast programs throughout the United States. We got a little ways to go here, but we're working at it. Today is the 26th of the month of August, 2 days from the 28th, which is the 50th anniversary of Dr. King giving his I Have a Dream speech, the one we all know about, which was given the third time in Washington. It was given one time, by the way, down here not too far from where I am. I'm in Flint. And the I Have a Dream speech Dr. King gave in June, I think June 25th, somewhere around there, June 23rd, June 25th, as they marched down Wood Avenue, the main artery in Detroit, and they marched all the way from about 6 miles down to Cobo Hall, had a big gathering there. Some estimates put it at numbers that exceed the numbers in Washington, D.C. I don't think that's true, but some people want to claim that that march was bigger than the one he had in Washington. I would put I was in Detroit at that time, and I would put the numbers somewhere around 25,000. As you know, in Washington, that estimate there of those members who met for Dr. King's vision were 250,000 in number, according to the acceptable statistics. And of that 250,000, 25,000 of them were white, and 225,000 were blacks. So when King says he had a dream, and he included blacks and whites, Protestants and Catholics, Jews and Gentiles, he didn't name everybody in that group. We should be clear about that. And those persons they named were there. And King looked out before a sea of people and tried at the very beginning to give his prepared speech, which was not the I Have a Dream speech. The one that he had given in Detroit is on tape, and it's very raw. You can listen to it. It's nowhere near the perfected quality that it was in Washington, because King had given it pretty much from a prepared text. I don't think the King really gave his greatest speeches when he was having to refer to a text. Even the speech he gave on April the 3rd, the day before he was assassinated, where we have him talking about having gone to the mountaintop and looked over and seen the promised land. When King was doing a prepared part of that speech, he spoke for a lot longer than what you see on the air. It's very rough, in terms of Dr. King being kind of confined by what is written on paper. And when he was able to move away from it and began to just go off of his raw emotions and was able to embrace the energy of the crowd, which is what a lot of the Baptist ministers do in terms of getting into the real sermon of the sermon they prepared, then that's when he began to soar like an eagle. And he soared like an eagle on that day. And that speech is still resonating 50 years later. And I want to tell you why that is true before we get off the air. And don't let me forget that in terms of there being a reason for why that speech will always be memorialized in time. It'll never get old. And we'll talk about why that's true maybe at the end of the program. Keep you tuned to the very end. But I will tell you why that speech would never grow old, and also why it would never be realized. So those that are saying we want to fulfill the dream and things like that, it's a wonderful goal to have and something to aspire to, but we will always be aspiring to it, and we will never really reach the goal. And I'm going to point out why that is true, that I don't think anybody else has pointed out thus far. And this is 50 years after I Have a Dream, and 48 years after Dr. King was assassinated, 45 years after Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. Of course, he was assassinated April the 4th, 1968. Anyway, Dr. King started off saying 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic image we stand today. And when he said 50 years ago, when he said 50 years ago, it reminded me of having to learn when I was in 8th grade the Gettysburg Address, where Abraham Lincoln had said in 1863, he said 80. King is saying 50. 87 years ago. And in 8th grade, when I had to learn that, when Lincoln said, in the aftermath of the Gettysburg battle that had occurred, which is at that point was the bloodiest battle that they had in the war. There would be some others that would follow it that would be more bloody. 600,000 persons lost their lives in this war, many of them civilians. He was talking about 87 years, 80 being 20 years, 80 being 80 years, and then add 7 years onto that, and then subtract that from 87 from the time of the Revolutionary War, beginning point. And he was saying then at the point of the beginning of the nation's dissolution of its relationship with Great Britain, 87 years earlier than where they stood at that point. Our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. I think everybody should have to. I really think everybody should learn that that speech, only because of the riveting aspects to it, as it begins to place us back into Lincoln's time period, which places us back into the time period which we want to forget, which is the founding of the nation, the first founding fathers, and King would be the founding father later on. And we don't want to forget that speech, and we don't want to forget the one that Dr. King gave. King stood up there and said 50 years ago, a great American, he said, in whose symbolic image, because in back of him was the Lincoln Memorial, the one that they recently had reports of having people putting some kind of ink on the monument. And did a couple of other national monuments and desecrated those monuments. But King was standing right there. And he said that he was standing in the symbolic image, because that was not Lincoln, it was a image of Lincoln that stood there in marble. And I have been there, how many times? I think 3 times, maybe 4, in the nation's capital, right there in that very vicinity. Couldn't get close in 63, but I was there, the last time I was there was 8/28/210, where they doubled Dr. King's numbers. And I can tell you those numbers were double, because I saw what was there in 63, and I can tell you that when Glenn Beck called that particular march, that had Dr. King's niece there at that site, and she spoke. They don't want to talk about her presence there, but Dr. King's niece, the daughter of Dr. King's brother, Albert King, who is named after Dr. King's grandfather on his mother's side. His mother's name was Alberta King, formerly Alberta Williams, and the daughter of the Reverend A.D. Williams, the one that had the church that he gave to, they passed down to Dr. King, who married his daughter, and Dr. King passed that church down to his son through A.D. Williams, the founder of the church, daughter. That's the legacy of that church, and that's where that was in fact laid down, through where King would be the inheritor of the church, the Ebenezer Baptist Church, and of course King was pastor of that church and also the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and those were the two churches that Dr. King was the pastor of during his 13 years involved in the civil rights movement. In fact, he was able to move that church, by the way, in Montgomery into the civil rights movement. It was quite amazing, because before King had gotten there, by the way, they had gotten rid of Stokes, because Stokes was Ronald Stokes was constantly trying to bring that church into the civil rights movement, and they didn't like his presentation and got rid of him, and really tried to freeze him out when he wouldn't leave. And he was in there with his heat turned off, and they had to he had to try to light some paper in the fireplace and keep the place warm, because he wasn't going to leave. But they finally, forced him out through starvation, more or less, and he had to leave. But when they brought King in, they had someone that was going to do even more than what Stokes had in mind. And that was started, as you know, with the Montgomery bus boycott. But 8 years after that was over, and they had successfully engaged the boycott, which started December the 5th, 1955. 8 years later, King is in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital, and there he is getting ready to give what he doesn't even know he's getting ready to give, which is the speech that put wings on the civil rights movement and had Dr. King soaring. Most people are not aware that Dr. King didn't even intend to give the I Have a Dream speech on that occasion. Dr. King started off saying 50 years ago, in those words that I just gave you a few minutes ago, and that was what that was his text. He was told to speak 5 minutes, and he had just been introduced by the person who had the idea of a march in Washington going back to 1941, who was Asa Philip Randolph, who had threatened to have a march on Washington, where he was in fact telling Roosevelt that they were going to have a march on Washington if he did not in fact do something that would make some entry into the civil rights arena, and to do something that would in fact calm some of the things that were happening in the country, where it was really bad for blacks during that time. And King was saying, if there were not some things taken upon itself by the federal government, they're going to bring 100,000 people to the nation's capital. This is 41, and the World War II was going on. We hadn't got involved in it yet, but we are close to it. And to say that they're going to have a march on Washington when we were at the precipice of being involved in a possible war, to have something that would divide the country at that time would have been problematical. But Randolph, quite frankly, and let's be honest about that, was basically bluffing. They claimed they had 100,000 persons, and Roosevelt didn't really believe him. And he turned to Walter White, who looked like a white man, quite frankly, because he had blue eyes and all of that, and he'd tell you he was black when he walked in the room. But he turned to Walter White, who was the head of the NAACP, and asked Walter White, how many persons would y'all have come to Washington if we had a march in Washington? And Walter White was bluffing as much as Randolph was bluffing, and said, Mr. President, if we had a march on Washington, we would be able to bring 100,000 people in here. And that's just the bottom line of what we would be able to do, and you've got to understand what time it is. And then Roosevelt then passed the 98 Executive Order 98.9840, I think it was, something around that, 90 something, which was the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practice Commission, came out of it. And Roosevelt had promised to put a commission in place that would look at fairness in terms of employment and things of that sort. So it's really not surprising that when they finally convened the March on Washington 22 years later, when they were not bluffing, but they didn't know even then how many persons were going to show up. It's not surprising that the march really was called the March on Washington for Freedom and Jobs. Really was called for Jobs and Freedom, because Randolph was bringing an economic component to the civil rights movement, where he was actually putting forth the notion that you cannot have freedom if you don't have the economy to, in fact, maintain it and of course, horse the freedom upon an economic base. And that, to me, by the way, is the one that's been forgotten here in black history. That falls upon the premises laid down in 1895 by Booker T. Washington, who was saying pretty much the same thing about cast down your buckets where you are, and do not let your agreements blind you to your opportunities, economic opportunities. So a lot of Washingtons in that march, and Randolph was carrying a banner that he would have first of all foregone and overlooked and really dismissed back in a time period when he was actually threatening to march on Washington, even when he was setting up the sleeping car porters and maids union. Back in 1925, he would have disavowed that he was actually parroting a lot of what Booker T. Washington had said. But that's exactly the foundation father of that particular idea. A lot of founding fathers here. But there's a founding father that's speaking on that microphone, and he's been told to speak 5 minutes. But Dr. King was speaking and giving his prepared text. And if you listen to it very carefully, a lot of people are surprised to find out that Dr. King didn't start off with, "I have a dream." Dr. King started off with these words about 50 years ago. And when peaceful persons hear the whole speech, which lasts about 18 minutes and 5 seconds or so, but more than 18 minutes, they are surprised that Dr. King started off with these words that led up to it. He doesn't get into the "I have a dream" aspect of his speech, which lasted about 13 of those 18 minutes, when he switched over and he said, and despite the difficulty of the moment, I still have a dream. Now, if you go and look at what was put out by one of Dr. King's attorneys, I read his book about the March on Washington, and he said that he could see Dr. King pushing his text aside. And he writes that he said to himself, Dr. King's getting ready to preach now. And Dr. King pushes his text aside and then dismisses what he had written and began to give the "I have a dream" speech. He said, and despite the difficulties of the moment, I still have a dream. Behind Dr. King was Mahalia Jackson. And she is the one that has been singing at these civil rights gatherings. She's pretty much the gospel singer of the civil rights movement. And she leaned into Dr. King when he was giving his prepared talk and saw it was not going anywhere and saw the King was not really soaring like he could, and she'd heard him do on certain occasions. She said, Dr. King, tell him about the dream. And that's why King pushed his text to the side, forgot about what he and others had worked on the night before up until wee morning hours of that morning of August the 28th. And Dr. King said, and despite the difficulties of the moment, I still have a dream. And then he was off and running. And having memory of the dream that he had given on 2 other occasions, one of which was down in Detroit, but one of which was in Birmingham. And he had worked on it in a place that I went down to do some research for the University of Michigan. I went to a place where I was told when I was down there in South Carolina, on the Sea Islands of South Carolina, I was at the Penn Center, and they told me Dr. King had worked in that speech originally there. I was in the very center where that speech was actually written. And I didn't know that until I got down there about, 3 or 4 years ago. That's never been written anywhere. But when I was down there, they told me that Dr. King had wanted to be into an isolated place, and that's where he worked on that speech. Rough in Detroit, rough in Birmingham. But in Washington, D.C., had that speech down to a science. And King was off and in his element. And the crowd was with him. And King was taking the energy of 250,000 people and he was telling them about a vision that he had that everyone could relate to. Everyone was soaring with King, and made that the Kodak moment in this nation's history, certainly in the 20th century. Very few speeches have been memorialized like this speech. But in that speech, Dr. King gave one that will live through the ages. And 50 years hence, as of Wednesday, we'll be watching what goes on, will be televised, probably on all the networks. Certainly they'll be covering on the news, or what will be going on in the nation's capital as they gather there to pay homage to this great leader. I brought some books to the studio because I wanted to have some documentation behind what I'm going to be saying here this afternoon, because I won't be saying what some of them will be saying in the nation's capital, because they're not going to be saying, not the ones I'm talking about, not going to be saying that they are the ones who have hijacked the civil rights movement. They're not its custodians, they are the hijackers of it. In fact, they are the deniers of the civil rights movement, not on the level of the Holocaust deniers, but they are denying the civil rights movement by claiming that the civil rights movement did not do its work and that they are doing that work now. That's hijacking, because the work that is assigned to this generation here, as quiet as it's kept, is not the work that was assigned to the generation that preceded us during the time of Dr. Martin Luther King. As quiet as it's kept, and you can make these movies about the butler, which I have not seen and I'm not going to see because I don't have time for people that have propagandistic intentions and motives behind things that they're doing. And I think it's very interesting, don't you, that at a time that we are celebrating the election of a black man to the White House as president on two different occasions in this country, one of which was in 2008, and the other one is 2012, and a black man has been elected on two different occasions as president of the United States, the most powerful office holder in the world, that we're talking about a butler in the White House and not the president in the White House who happens to be black. Well, that's interesting, because we are not the butler anymore. We are the president of the United States. And Eric Holder is the black attorney general of the United States. And before that occurred, even we could see the progress been made, because Condoleezza Rice was the first black woman and the second black person to become the Secretary of State in this country. She was the first black woman Secretary of State, the first black woman, because and the only black woman, by the way, Miss Secretary of State. Not the only black person, because Colin Powell preceded her to the Secretary of State position, which means that this person represents the United States on the international level. And that was something that the world had to be attentive to as they began to represent the whole of the United States of America, knew they had been born. Some of which came out of the civil rights movement, but some of it was really just the fact of that once the politicians were moved to the side by Dr. King, then the common decency of the American people could come through. Because that's really what that movement was really about. It was really about moving the politicians out of the way, so that the decency, the common decency of the American people, who are the most decent people on the planet, the most given people on the planet. I know you've been told other things, they try to beat you down with this narrative, but the reason why Oprah had to go over to Switzerland to find racism is because once we got the politicians out of the way, then that which was debilitating as far as racism was concerned in this country had dissipated. And that's why we are talking about things like what someone said at a concert, which is what Riley Cooper said, the Philadelphia Eagles player, said at a concert. Nobody was supposed to hear, and he thought he was talking in private. Or what Paula Deen said 2 decades ago, or some other nonsense. Or we're going to elevate George Zimmerman up to the place where he's now white and not Hispanic, and make that into a white racist incident, is because once we got the politicians out of the way, the decency of the American people dissipated, and what we have right now is the absence of the racism. There was a racial impediment holding the group back, because it was really the politicians holding blacks back. White politicians were benefiting from claiming that blacks were this group and that group, had these qualities and didn't have those qualities, and using it as a battering ram to justify their own political advantage they were trying to get by keeping blacks and whites divided, so they would not look at the ineptitude of those they were electing. They just look at them through a lens of race, and not hold them to a higher standard. And we know there was a game being played because we have it on record. We have Wallace saying in 1958, when he first ran for the governor of Alabama against John Patterson, where he was defeated by John Patterson, and will say later that John Patterson won because John Patterson has outsegged him, meaning that he used the word segregation more than George Wallace used it, but he said he would never be outsegged again. And in 1962, when Wallace ran for a second time to be governor of Alabama, he stood up there and outsegged his opponent. And he said at his inauguration into office, and in the following year, he said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. And that was all the politics that was being played down the South by these corrupt politicians, which George Wallace was one of the leading ones, but he wasn't the only one out there who wasn't playing the race card in the South in the political arena. That's you, Stennis, you, Eastland, and Mississippi, and Ross Barnett over there, who's acting as governor. There's you, Faubus, over there in Arkansas, that shut down the schools rather than to integrate, according to the Supreme Court case in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education, where they closed the school down. All this is nothing but politics by these politicians. But once we got them out of the way, what you could see here was that once they stopped blocking access with their nonsense, political nonsense, then the American people could then embrace fairness, which we are primarily a fair-minded country, and they are to embrace fairness, and out of that comes all these things we now see taking place. I was looking at a report yesterday where they're talking about we had 1,000 black elected officials as of 1970. When they took the next census report of how many persons were elected officials that were black, and there's about 1,000 plus of those officials. And today, they were showing on Chris Wallace's show on the program that comes on Sunday mornings on Fox. It showed that there are about 15,000 black elected officials in this country. And so the fundamental fairness has now shown itself, because the ones that were fundamentally unfair was not the American people. It was the fundamental unfairness of those who were using race in order to drive a narrative through the sea that they created between the gulf between blacks and whites, where they were driving this wedge between the two groups for political advantage, and they're doing that right now in terms of just driving using that same narrative, which I hear even this president using. Trayvon Martin could have been my son, and I could have been Trayvon Martin, and things like that, which really have no basis in a political discourse and a part of the most powerful office holder in the world. But the reason for it is the same reason that was being played before. These people are playing the race card. And there was a situation down in, in Oklahoma, where Christopher Lane was killed by 3 black youth, really 3 thugs, who shot this man in cold blood. You probably heard this case, the one that was the man that was from Australia. They got in the car. This guy was jogging. They got in the car and went after him. And as he was jogging, shot him in the back. He didn't know what hit him. He died right there on the street. And this 20-year-old young man who was playing baseball at the university in Oklahoma was killed by a group of thugs that he never even saw. And we haven't heard anybody talk about whose son he looks like. I mean, the president could embrace his white side and claim that it to be his son. Could have been his son if he had married someone on his mother's side. That could have been his son. But he married someone in the racial group on his father's side, but not somebody from his father's country, which is Kenya. I'm not saying Obama was born in Kenya. But let's get real with what is happening with these divisional politics that are still being played at this very moment. And when they meet in Washington, I'm going to be watching it very carefully because I want to see what they're going to say. Because a lot of those persons, it's like those talking about, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. You remember that Negro spiritual, which was really talking about the slave owners. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there, heaven. Well, all those talking about the civil rights movement are not partisan, nor are they sympathetic to the call of the civil rights movement. So King is given a dream and so on, and they are going to celebrate what King said. And I want to read you some things here about some of the ones that will be there. How many of you know about Ralph Abernathy, who will not be there because Ralph Abernathy deceased soon after his book came out, a very important book, and I'm glad I wrote it before he deceased, because this book is a very important part of the narrative of the civil rights movement. It's called "And the Walls Came Tumbling Down." And the Walls Came Tumbling Down by Ralph Abernathy, and it says here by Carl Rowan. This is history that must be read. And Ralph Abernathy, who was the right-hand man of Dr. Martin Luther King, wrote the book, the hardcover version of the book. And then after the book came out, where he was in fact saying some things that were not in line with the political correct view of Dr. King, because Ralph did not want to, in fact, embrace this notion that King was perfect, because he wanted to make sure that persons that are now in school aspiring to be leaders could understand you don't have to be perfect to be leaders, because Dr. King wasn't perfect. And here they're trying to paint this image of Dr. King that Dr. King would himself have rejected. I mean, has anybody listened to Dr. King's drama major speech? Tell them not to, if you're there, when I meet my day, tell them not to talk a long time. Tell them don't mention that I have Nobel Peace Prize. He said that's not important. Don't tell them that I had 400 other awards. That's not important. He said, tell them that I just try to do God's will. And that was important to Dr. King. But this idea that King did not have warts and flaws, pimples, and so on, that's not what King wanted. And Ralph was trying to humanize King, and that was not beneficial to those that were trying to act like nobody else could touch his mantle, because it would benefit them. It wouldn't benefit the legacy of Dr. King, because we don't need to have Dr. King perfect. We saw him stand up to Bull Connor. We saw him stand up to George Wallace. And that's enough. We heard the dream that he gave. And that's more than enough to embrace what Dr. King stood for. And we don't need a saint, which he was not a saint, to in fact bring about the embracing of a man who deserves our allegiance to what he taught and what he died for. And I take that very seriously. So I'll be watching what they're doing up in Washington as they talk about the dream. But there are very few people that's out there quite in the public limelight who are custodians of the dream and who are in fact credible in terms of saying they believe in the dream. Most of them out there as charlatans and opportunists. Let me read something that is said here in Ralph Abernathy's book, in the softback version of "And the Walls Came Tumbling Down," which I'm glad Ralph wrote the softback version, because in the softback version he wrote another introduction to answer his critics, because his critics were all over Ralph Abernathy, because they wanted Ralph to shut up and stop bringing forth what he knew, because wherever King was, Ralph was there also. Ralph Abernathy was there also. Not them. Not all of those persons were there. Ralph was there. Ralph Abernathy was there at the very beginning, and no one else can claim that to be true. Not John Lewis, not Jesse Jackson, and Sharpton had not even been heard of yet. We don't hear about Sharpton until he did the Tawana Brawley fraudulent event in 1987. So that's like him being on the scene, what, 25 years? Just at 45 years? None of them were there at the very beginning of the civil rights drama led by Dr. Martin Luther King. But Ralph Abernathy is there. And really, when Dr. King is assassinated in '68, the mantle of leadership fell upon Ralph Abernathy, and it was maneuvered out from under him by the charlatans, one of whom is Jesse Jackson. I'm going to get to him presently when I get to him with his other book. But I'll read some parts of it. He doesn't mention names in this particular reading right here in the introduction to the softback version of the book called "And the Walls Came Tumbling Down." But he doesn't mention names, but that's who he's talking about here, along with some of the others, when he says this right here in the introduction to the softback version of the book. Ralph Abernathy says, "I have been comforted by the many kind words that have been written about my book," meaning the hardcover of the book, "by men and women who love Martin and at the same time saw the problems I faced in trying to write an honest and credible book." Listen to that. These people, literary critics, editors, historians, understand two things that my denouncers have failed to grasp. Number one, that you don't fool history by withholding the truth. You don't withhold the truth and fool history. Number two, that Martin Luther King Jr., both as a human being and as a symbol of the civil rights movement, is now beyond the range of those who would seek to diminish his greatness or to compromise his integrity. With all his flaws, he still stands where he stands in history. Like Washington, Lincoln, and a handful of other leaders who are the epic heroes of the nation, Martin will grow in the hearts of future Americans, regardless of what I or other biographers have to say about him. He is a permanent part of our folk imagination, and his story will be passed down from generation to generation more by word of mouth than by printed word. His life has become a legend, and legends are important to give people a sense of who they are and what, in their best moments, they can become. Black people in particular needed a hero of their own, someone to embody their love and faith and courage in the face of hundreds of years of oppression. Excuse me. Hundreds of years of oppression. And in all his humanity, Martin was that hero. He loved deeply, he had faith in God and his own people, and he had the courage to face death in behalf of the millions whose unique historical burden he understood and shared. And then Abernathy answers directly his critics, those who would have him to stand down from the truth that he knew, because Ralph was there, and they weren't. And they could not come behind Ralph and say anything, and they knew it, so they wanted him to shut up. And they wanted him to shut up just like they wanted Bill Cosby to shut up. And they wanted Bill Cosby to shut up for the same reason. Don't turn their cars over. Don't expose what's really going on. Hide behind the legacy of King, lift him out of his element and make him into something he was not, and continue the shafting of the people that he represented so well up until his death in 1968. But here's what Ralph said in his answer to his critics directly. Here's what he stated, and this is on page 15 of his softback version of his autobiography, and of the autobiography, quite frankly, of the civil rights movement. He says, "I am no longer bothered about the self-perpetuating members of the black establishment, some of whom now reminisce about battles they did not fight and wounds they did not suffer. I am concerned for the future and for the children. We must provide them with strong leaders who can help them stay in school, stay off drugs, and stay out of jail." And you know what? When you talk about the movement today, that's what Ralph was actually laying out if they were in fact carrying this movement forward. But the reason why I know that they are civil rights movement deniers is because they are going back and fighting the battles that have already been fought. If they were not denying the movement, they would be carrying the movement from the place where the mantle was dropped by King and doing the work that they're called to do in this generation, which they're not doing. And that's why you see the problems that are now extant in all the black communities throughout the United States. Don't get me started on some other books I didn't bring, such as Robert C. Smith's book, We Have No Leaders. We must provide them with strong leaders who can help them to stay in school, stay off drugs, and stay out of jail. Those are the challenges that Ralph Abernathy was talking about. We need job training that will prepare uneducated and unskilled blacks to fill their share of new technological jobs our society is daily creating. We need people to march again. This time for economic empowerment and economic opportunity, and for programs that will transform our inner cities from battlegrounds into peaceful and prosperous communities. Most of all, we need to believe in ourselves again, the way we once did in Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma, when the civil rights movement gave us dignity and purpose as a people, when we were led by the iconic, he doesn't use the word iconic, but when we were led by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Let me read something else to you from another book, and this book is from Fred Powledge. The book is called Free at Last, because there's a question mark after the word at last, and so it's Free at Last with a question mark. And it's subtitled The Civil Rights Movement and the People Who Made It. On pages Roman number 14 and 15, he talks about those who did not make it. They want to stand up there as if they were primary to its formation. And we have to set the record straight. And he does that here on pages 14 and 15 of his introduction by saying the following. And I have to read quite a bit of this because it is quite important that we point out what is now going on, because we have to understand that the movement today is not the movement that Dr. King intended. Dr. King didn't intend for charlatans to get up here and start railroading the people and taking advantage of people for financial gains. King didn't have hardly any money when he died. He gave everything he had gotten in terms of income from his Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, donated that to the SCLC. And I know some people that would come out of the church, they visit King's church, come out of the church looking for King's car, and they could not believe that Volkswagen sitting in front of the church was his car. They thought he was looking for a Cadillac. And there's this car right here. The King would tell them, I want you to come home over to the house for dinner. And they over here sitting by this big car parked behind King's car, and waiting for King to come out of the church. And there's King going to this Volkswagen. They couldn't believe it. But that's who King was. Let me tell you who these people are. He says that because Americans now get more of their information from what they see on screen than what they read from paper, and because what reaches the screen has such profound influence on what people think, historical truth is in deep trouble. And so little precious documents that were carelessly engraved onto cheap paper, the truth of what happened in those years is fading and is in danger of being lost. Pseudo-truths, semi-truths, partial truths, pseudo-truths replace the actual truth. In the minds of untold numbers of Americans, for example, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the civil rights movement. Thought it up, led it, produced his victory single-handedly, became a sole martyr. School children, including black school children, are taught this. When there were a lot of folks around Dr. King, a lot of people embraced this movement, both blacks and whites. Some of them, by the way, were in Montgomery, and those that were not in Alabama, in Birmingham, Alabama, where they had Bull Connor washing those children down the street, they came all over the nation to join Dr. King. From the four corners of the United States. When they saw those children washed down the street with those hoses, all of America rose up. And they rose up in Birmingham, Alabama also. That's not, that's, oh yes, that's not been talked about. I'm going to talk about it on my Facebook wall because, you know what, today, folks, I wrote the most controversial piece on race that's ever been written on Facebook in the history of Facebook. And I have not read all the Facebook posts, but I know what they're writing on Facebook, and I know the courage of those who wrote it. I know the political correct status that they tried to promote. And I'm not politically correct. And no one has written what I posted before I came to the studio. And you need to read it. Because I want to talk about that time period and this time period and what has changed in terms of Dr. King's dream, which has been turned upside down on his head by the very people that he died for, who are no longer embracing that dream.
It seems like there's kind of a split right in the King family itself about, there's kind of like a splitting of like what they thought his vision represented. Some are more, a couple of them are more on the conservative camp, and the other one are more, they're pushing the same agenda I see like people like Sharpton and Jackson. So it's being perverted and corrupted. His image, his mentality, his viewpoint, his vision is already being challenged by the people, members of his own family. Yeah,
they're not totally. You're right about that, John. 99 and 9/10% of that is correct. I have to point out one thing here, is that I had predicted that when Coretta Scott King died, I had predicted that the King family would not allow Jesse Jackson nor Al Sharpton to speak at their funeral, and they did not speak. And I want to tell you why that was true. Because they never forgave Jesse Jackson for, in fact, doing what he did when their father was laying on that balcony, where he actually lied about having embraced Dr. Martin Luther King and was the last one to talk to him alive, claiming he had called his head and asked Dr. King during his final moments on this earth if Dr. King could hear him. None of that happened, and that embrace never occurred. Jesse Jackson was lying and making it up. And then used Dr. King's blood, which he wiped on his shirt. I have evidence of that by the fact that in the book written by Andy Young, who's another one of Dr. King's aides, he's gotten lost too. But in his book about the civil rights movement, he says that when Jesse Jackson took Dr. King's blood and wiped on his shirt, he thought that what Jesse Jackson was getting ready to do was say that, okay, Dr. King is dead, they killed our leader, the blood means that we are now embracing the martyr's blood and we're going to carry this movement forward. But that's not what Jesse Jackson had in mind. That blood Jesse Jackson used the next day to go before the city council in Chicago. In fact, before the state legislature in the next day, and stood there with this narrative he had created that is talked about in this book right here by Barbara Reynolds called Jesse Jackson, the Man, the Movement, and the Myth, a book that you can't find because this book has been suppressed. But I was able to get a copy of it because I was aware that when the book first came out back in 1970. But they're not totally in lockstep with Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton because they have their own interest in the legacy of Dr. King, because there's always this fiduciary aspect of King's legacy, which is the King Center, and that has nothing to do with Jesse Jackson and the charlatans that are standing up in King's name. And so there's this split that goes along that line because of some of the financial angles of the movement, and also some of the charlatanism that some of the charlatans have gotten in this movement. And I had said that Jesse Jackson would not be allowed to be on the dais, and he would not be allowed to say anything in that meeting. They treated him like a stepchild, at the funeral, and also Al Sharpton. If you notice that they put T.D. Jakes up there as the pastor. And you know, John, another one of the events, Jesse Jackson, who wants to be the pastor of Black America, he's our quote-unquote minister, but he's been so discredited among blacks that when he flew in to speak at Whitney Houston's funeral, and there were those who knew Houston, had pastored Houston, and he sat there for 3 hours and sat him right there in that chair on the stage. He sat there embarrassed. They didn't let him say one word over a funeral that lasted 3.5 hours. They didn't let him open up his mouth at that funeral. And that should tell us something also about this man being in front of the limelight, but people have caught on to who this man actually is, and now this man has been totally discredited. But so you're right about most of that, John, where you said that there is that split that went on, but a lot of it is that they are charlatans also, because they've made a mockery of Dr. King's legacy as well by not embracing aspects of King's dream, and out here talking now this meandering nonsense that they're carrying, this water that they're carrying, which has nothing to do with this man's vision. But there is a split that is inside the movement, and you even see the split, by the way, in terms of Dr. King's niece. She was with Glenn Beck, and she was in Washington. I was there, by the way, so I saw it with my own eyes. I heard the speeches with my own ears, and she was over there with Glenn Beck, who were trying to say he's racist. And she's over there with Glenn Beck at the time when across town, Sharpton had another march going on at the same time, trying to say he was embracing Dr. King. And they were absolutely frightened by Glenn Beck calling a march on 8/28/2010. You know why? Because when Beck called that march, there was a sea of white folks out there in the mall that King stood up there in 1963. And in the mall, there were 500,000, doubling the numbers that heard King give his I Have a Dream speech. And they're out there, 96% of whom are white, and now they've embraced their dream. NBC, you couldn't allow that to get out. And that's why you came with this lie that there were only 87,000 people that were there. I was there. And I can tell you that, because I was there in 63, and I can tell you this, and nobody can contradict this. There were twice as many people in that mall as it was in 1963. You can tell that to the people that were not there. I'm a historian, but you don't tell that to me. I'm here to confront you with it.
When you were there in '63, did you realize then the impact that would have that gathering would have had on the U.S. History at that point? Were you really aware of that? Or?
I was not aware of that, John. I think that Dr. King would be surprised of how big he has gotten in the aftermath of his death, because let's face it, everywhere King was going, King was vilified. And it's kind of obscene, quite frankly, for the politicians to embrace Dr. King after opposing everything he did for 13 years. So then this embrace of Dr. King is quite interesting, because they were not so much in his corner while he was alive. And it took him 15 years, by the way, after his death to embrace his iconic image and make his birthday a national holiday. By the way, Oprah, you and Lee Daniels have made the film on The Butler, and you tried to act like Reagan was some kind of person that was not down with the cause more so than these liberals on the other side. Let's understand that it was under Ronald Reagan that Dr. King's birthday was in fact nationalized in 1983, and it was under Reagan 3 years later where the first celebration of Dr. King's birthday had occurred. And that did not happen under Carter, who was president in 1976, and
or Johnson before.
Or Johnson before that, and they had a chance to do it. Johnson, of course, went out in 69, not running again, and Nixon came in. But after that, you have Ford, and then you have Carter. Carter didn't do it, and Carter was from the same state as was Dr. Martin Luther King. And it did not happen under him. It happened under Ronald Reagan, that they're trying to act like in the film called The Butler. This man was so against black folks and all the other. The fact about it is that Eugene Allen, who is the person after whom the film The Butler is made, had a picture on his wall, I think, of only two presidents. It might have been one. I think it was two. I think it was Kennedy, and the other one was Ronald Reagan. You know why? Because Ronald Reagan made Eugene Allen the maitre d' of the White House, which had not occurred before, and invited him to the dinner in the White House, where he was not the butler that night. He was the maitre d' sitting with the dignitaries at the one in which they had the dignitaries coming from all over the world, and was in fact there. Let me read this real quickly here in terms of Jackson. Jesse Jackson is widely perceived as a hero of the movement, a perception he rarely has denied. But to refer to Jesse Jackson as a civil rights leader from the movement of the 60s is simply wrong, and it does great injustice to the leaders and followers who were in fact there. Okay, when we get to Washington on Monday, we'll see how that goes. Glad you stayed tuned and hope you learned something. Until next time, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you will never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.